Welcome to the lecture for Unit 3, which reviews the trait dispositional level for investigating personality. Some of the main questions our readings will address are: what traits or qualities characterize people? How can differences be captured and described in people's traits? And what role does situation play in the way people behave? And how does that relate to their traits? The constructs of traits and types are defined in the readings, and this lecture outlines the reading, so you can find this information in your textbook too. But basically, the trait approach is used to label, measure, and classify people by the way they behave and with adjectives that are often common everyday words. And at the trait level, it's assumed that behavior is primarily determined by stable, generalized traits that people possess, qualities they express themselves with in many contexts and across contexts. In contrast to that, looking at types, that's been another way to look at personality over time. As far as 400 BC ago, there were four main types of personality described about people, and they're listed here: choleric, melancholic, sanguine, and phlegmatic. And they were ways to describe the way people tended to behave or act, and they were thought to represent personality, if you will. More recently, personality theory has looked at introversion and extroversion as dimensions or types to describe personality. And I think you're pretty familiar with these terms, and the definitions are here. So I'm not going to read all these slides to you because there are a lot of them. A distinction to be aware of, though, as we understand the book's approach to understanding personality and the evolution of its theory, or theories about it, are typologies, which look at types of personality, and they tend to break people into discontinuous categories like male or female. And that's in contrast to traits, which tend to be things that we can measure on a continuous dimension, like friendliness. You can be really unfriendly, kind of unfriendly, pretty friendly, or really friendly. It's a continuous variable with a low to high range, as opposed to something that's dichotomous, like a type might be. And the graph here is from the textbook and gives examples of types. You can see I'm sorry, I moved my mouse around and you can see it here. And then also traits. So you can see the traits follow a continuum and the types are more dichotomous. The way we know someone has a particular trait is that we infer it from their behavior, and we do assume traits are quantifiable, and scalable or measurable on a continuum. Individuals often differ greatly and consistently in their responses to the same situation or stimulus, and that's a way of exemplifying that people are different. We don't have the same personalities. We can all be in the same situation but have a different interpretation of it and a different behavioral response to it. So traits become, using the trait model of understanding personality, a way to explain behavior. I act this way because I have this trait. You react a different way because you have some other trait. Maybe I'm nervous and I react with fear, and you're confident and you react with excitement. So the trait is the variable of interest if you follow a trait model of understanding personality. And this slide gives a graphic of that type of situation where there's one particular stimulus and several people respond to it differently and for different reasons, perhaps because they carry some internal trait that varies across them. And there's just a prompt here to think about your own personal experience. Maybe you can think of a time where you've been in a situation like that where people have reacted differently to the same stimulus. And just maybe think about that and think about how it relates to the readings and how you might theorize or relate to the theories in the book about that. A quick example that comes to my mind in recording this is going to an amusement park. I went to a big one in New York State this summer, and the rides certainly can elicit different responses from different people, everything from terror to hilarity. So that might relate to the people's traits that they have within themselves. As educators, we need to be careful because I think it's very common as people just to think about traits people have and describe them by their traits. And as psychologists or teachers or whatever we might be through our training, we understand that someone is exhibiting behavior, and we can be very clinical about that. But in everyday life and when you're working, it's easy sometimes to slip into describing the person as their behavior, not as exhibiting that behavior. So for example, instead of saying Johnny behaves in kind of a lazy way when he's challenged, we might say Johnny's lazy. And then that can lead into prejudice and bias against people, and we need to be careful about that, obviously. And I have in green on this slide an idea just to think about how labels and diagnoses and so forth can lead us to make a lot of attributions or assumptions about people that might not really always be true in every situation. So we just need to be careful about how we label people's traits because they may not really be that stable or accurate. So we want to be careful about that. The book reviews several of the major trait theorists and the ideas they had. They're listed here, and I'll give you a few examples on the next slides. Allport is a pretty important figure in the history of psychology, and he looked at traits in people and their personalities, and he talked about and central traits, and also looked at secondary dispositions or narrow traits and attitudes. So do the reading about his model because it's pretty influential, particularly for this level of understanding personality that we're reviewing this week. Like Allport, Cattell also distinguished between types of traits and labeled them in different ways for us to understand them a little bit differently. He talked about common traits, which are possessed by many people in different degrees. So we might, I might be anxious about socializing, and you might be, but to a different degree. And also unique traits, which are particular to individuals, not universal. He used data to define those source traits, and our text does a nice job describing the ways you would collect data to look at the traits and types of personality dimensions. He talked about dynamic traits that are relevant to people being set into action with respect to goals, ability traits that relate to the effectiveness people have at approaching and attaining their goals, and temperament traits that relate to the energy level or reactivity of a person. And if you've taken ED 601, we talk about Bowlby's theories regarding temperament, and that deals a lot with reactivity of infants to stimuli in the environment. So there's some similarities there to think about. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Eysenk's ideas in looking at personality on the dimensions of introversion and extroversion, and that's considered a dimensional trait. But he also looked at how that relates to emotional stability. So you can see the graphic here has two dimensions, from introversion to extroversion, and very stable to very unstable personality characteristics, if you will. And there are some adjectives here, you can see my mouse spinning around, that tend to describe the where a person lies on those two dimensions, the horizontal and the vertical one. And you can see how that relates back to Hippocrates' early model of personality. So it's kind of interesting to see how this has evolved into more modern terminology and also been simplified to look at just two main dimensions. So you'll read about that, and his model is pretty commonly known. I'm going to try to keep these lectures limited in time, so I'm going to go through these quickly. But basically, trait theories share these characteristics with one another. They admit that there's fluctuation in traits, but they look to find stable traits that exist over situations and time in people. They know that there are differences between traits, which are stable, enduring characteristics, and states, which might be like moods or emotional reactions to situational episodes. There's a search to find basic traits within the person, and these theories tended to not ignore, but pay less attention to situation than some of the more modern theories like Mischel's, who wrote our textbook. So they paid attention to the traits within the people less than what circumstances might be eliciting those behaviors. And they also sought to collect data across situations to increase reliability in measuring traits. They tried to find stability because they believed that traits were stable. So their research techniques to validate these theories did look at across situations to try to collect data and prove that certain traits do exist across them. And another model talked about in the trait section of our readings this week is the psycholexical approach, which is basically how well do the terms we use in our daily language describe our traits and personalities. And Wiggins tried to make a taxonomy called here of the domain of interpersonal behavior that looked at how words could be used to characterize someone, and they go from kind of opposites, from like quarrelsome to agreeable to aloof to gregarious and so on, and try to figure out where people fit on these dimensions to quantify or put an accurate label on their personality traits. And the textbook we used to use and this textbook also go back to say that the big 5 trait dimensions that have been identified through factor analysis are really pretty well accepted and used or considered useful for predicting some important life outcomes. They're not comprehensively accurate, and they can't predict specific behavior in specific situations, but there have been 5 trait dimensions that are appear to be pretty reliable. So I will talk about them in a second. This chart describes an instrument used to measure the big 5. I mean, it's not the only one that looks at these particular personality traits, but it's a commonly used one, and the book talks about it. But the 5 traits in the big 5 are neuroticism and extroversion, openness to experience, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. And as noted with traits, there's a continuum. You can be from low to high on each of these. And again, there's a pretty good consensus that these are somewhat useful for describing personality. One example of a trait that might be fairly stable over time is if you look at 3-year-olds' activity levels. There may be some likelihood that they'll will continue to have similar activity or aggression or competitiveness traits later on in life. I didn't word that well, sorry. But the stability varies over what characteristic you're looking at and a person's experience at different points in their development. So again, think about what you learned in ED 601 and the things that can change you over time. External events can change you as well as health incidences or whatever. So just think about how stable your key traits are. What do you think are the main traits about you and your personality, and how stable are they, and why are they the way they are? These are questions that this type of analysis of personality prompt. And this slide just shows that an early childhood trait could affect a person's experience. For example, if a child's ill-tempered, they might not do as well in school, they might not attend school as much, or they might be in trouble in misinstruction, and they might end up getting a less desirable job in the future. Well, by that background experience that's related to their internal trait early on, they could later in life have less occupational stability, less income, maybe less stable relationships and things of that nature too. So early experience and traits can affect later experiences and outcomes. So it's interesting to look at what these connections are so we can help people follow more productive paths. So there are some limitations and some contributions and benefits to looking at traits and types of personalities. Factor analysis has helped us identify some major and possibly kind of universal traits that people and personalities have, but they're really reliant on what psychologists and researchers call them, and they may or may not be really meaningful psychologically or in different cultural contexts and so forth. So it's interesting, but they may not apply in every situation. Traits may or may not explain the causes of behaviors and interactions. They may just be descriptive summaries. Boos and Craig in 1983 treat dispositions as act or behavioral trends, not explanations, and that may be a more accurate way to look at them because we know you can't accurately predict behavior in every situation. And trait ratings are also subject to bias. They may reflect stereotypes of the raters instead of the actual person's real traits within them. But there is some research that suggests that raters' traits constructs, the way they think about traits, and how people they rate actually act are related. So there is some validity to it likely, but there is also subjectivity to bias. So just things to be aware of in terms of how credible the theories are at this point. The second part of the readings, chapter 4, is going to address dispositions. And in that chapter as well, the book will focus on the behavioral expression of a person's traits, depending very much on their situation. And there's an example here of how that can happen. Mischel talks in detail about how he developed a model of using if-then statements to figure out when people will behave in what way, as opposed to making universal predictions based on their traits. And this lends evidence that the situation is important in how behaviors come out, as well as traits. The authors note that we expect people to behave similarly across situations, but they really don't behave as accurately or as consistently as we think they will. So that's kind of an interesting conundrum. Mischel said that these findings that people don't behave as consistently as we expect are due to limitations not just in how we're measuring things, but also in the assumptions we make about how consistent people are and how consistent personality traits are and how stable they are. Moving through history in the 70s, Bem and Allen noted that there's a personality paradox where there's low cross-situational consistency of behavior, even though we expect there to be consistency. So that generated a long debate about what's more important, the person or the situation, in determining outcomes and behavior. From that arose situationism, or the belief that personality is not as important in determining behaviors as situations are. So that really kind of changed the focus of research in personality theory and social psychology. And social psychologists talk about something called the fundamental attribution error, which is where we incorrectly view personality distributions and not the situation as causing behavior. So again, the focus is now becoming to be on situation, not just personality. This slide illustrates how the focus went from considering people as being the variable that changes to looking at the situation as the variable that changes in terms of behavioral outcomes. The challenge then is to see how variation occurs and on what internal and external situations variation in behavior depends. So the goal is to find a stable pattern that's distinctive for each person, or to really identify what personality is. The next few slides review the end of Chapter 4, and I'm running out of time on this recording and don't want to keep you too long. So review those slides and look at the last one for reflection and let me know if you have questions. Thank you.